Believe this. No child is born with a hardened heart. No baby enters the world with the desire to rebel, defy, or distance themselves from their parents. Every child is born with the most primal and pure instinct: to be loved, to be held, to have their existence acknowledged. But not every child is fortunate enough to grow in fertile soil. Some grow up in houses with walls, but without embraces. Some live with their parents, yet never truly feel like they have parents. Some hear voices in the house every day, yet never feel heard. They are one of them. From an early age, they learned that their tears were often considered excessive. Their fears were labeled as childish. Their opinions were called disrespectful. Their feelings were dismissed as trivial. They never knew exactly when they began to feel alone, but the feeling grew slowly, like a shadow stretching longer as the sun sets. At first, they were simply confused. Why, when they came home with good grades, was there no proud smile? Why, when they wanted to talk about their day, were their parents too busy with their own concerns? Why, when they were hurt, did they receive a lecture instead of a hug? They tried to be better, quieter, more obedient, more accomplished. They thought perhaps love had to be earned, had to be proven, had to be deserved. But the harder they tried, the more invisible they felt.
Neglect does not always come in the form of violence. Sometimes it appears in quieter ways, in not being cared about, in not being asked, in not being noticed. And that form is often the most painful, because wounds that cannot be seen are often treated as if they do not exist. Their childhood was not filled with shouting. Their home looked normal in the eyes of others. They had enough food, went to school, wore neat clothes. No one suspected that behind all of that was a small heart constantly asking, "Why am I not enough to be loved?" That question grew up with them. When they were 8 years old, they once had a high fever. They clearly remember lying alone in their room, hearing the television playing in the living room. They wanted to be held, wanted company, wanted someone to sit beside them and say, "It's okay, I'm here." But what came was only medicine and instructions to rest. They never forgot how that night felt, not because of the illness, but because of the realization, their first awareness that they were alone. From that moment on, they stopped expecting too much.
They learned to wipe their tears before anyone could see. They learned to bury their stories before they were ever spoken. They learned to be strong without leaning on anyone. And without realizing it, they began building walls. The walls were invisible to others, but they knew that every time they were disappointed and no one cared, another brick was laid. Every time they tried to speak and were cut off mid-sentence, another layer hardened. The walls protected them, but they also confined them. As they entered adolescence, they changed, not into a wild child, not into a dramatic rebel, but they became cold, too independent for their age, too resilient for someone so young. People praised them. "You're so strong. You're so mature. You never trouble your parents." They did not know that none of it was a choice. It was a survival mechanism. They never wanted to be the child who never caused trouble. They wanted to be the child who was allowed to, a child who could cry without being judged, a child who could be weak without being seen as a burden. But they learned that weakness had no room. So they swallowed it.
Slowly, the pain that was never acknowledged began to change shape. It was no longer tears. It became indifference. It became excessive boldness. It became the attitude of, "I don't need anyone." When someone is used to facing everything alone, fear of consequences begins to shrink. What could hurt more than feeling unloved by your own parents? They made decisions without much thought.
They did not dwell on risks. They had lived without a sense of security for too long. Threats felt ordinary. People began to judge. You're stubborn. You're selfish. You're ungrateful. But no one asked, what wound are you carrying so deeply? There was one moment that changed them even more. One night, after yet another long argument that left them feeling misunderstood, they sat alone in their room. Their parents' words echoed in their mind. You're never grateful. We've done our best. You're too sensitive. They looked into the mirror, and for the first time, they asked themselves, am I really the problem? That question struck harder than any shout.
All this time, they had blamed themselves. Maybe they weren't good enough. Maybe they demanded too much. Maybe they were simply hard to love. But that night, for the first time, they considered another possibility. What if it wasn't them? What if they were simply a child who needed to be held? The tears they had long held back finally fell. Not hysterical sobs, just a quiet stream carrying a strange sense of relief. They began to understand something bitter. Perhaps their parents had never learned how to love in a healthy way. Perhaps they too carried wounds from their own past. But understanding does not mean justifying. They no longer wanted to keep sacrificing themselves to maintain a relationship that was slowly breaking them. They wanted to live. The decision to distance themselves was never easy. They did not wake up one morning and say, today I stopped caring. It was a long process, full of guilt, full of doubt, full of questions. How could a child distance themselves from their parents? But how could they continue staying in a place that made them feel worthless? They tried to talk, to explain, to open their heart, but every attempt ended with the same wall. You're exaggerating. That's just your feelings. We never meant to hurt you. Perhaps there was never any intention to hurt, but a wound is still a wound, even when unintentional. And in the end, they chose themselves. Not because they didn't love their parents, but because they wanted to save what little love they had left. They feared that if they stayed in the same environment, they would completely lose the ability to feel anything at all. Distance does not mean hatred. Distance means acknowledging limits. They moved out, built a life of their own, learned about mental health, learned to recognize their emotions, learned that their emotional needs were valid.
For the first time in their life, they began asking themselves, what do I feel? What do I need? Simple questions that once had no space. Healing was not instant. There were days when guilt returned, nights when they longed for the version of their parents they had hoped for, not the ones they had. Moments when they felt like a disobedient child. But every time they nearly gave up, they remembered the little child who once lay alone with a fever. The little child who held back tears for fear of being seen as weak. The little child who only wanted to be held. They were doing this for that child. They began building healthier relationships with others. They learned to trust. They learned that love does not have to be earned through self-sacrifice. And most difficult of all, they learned to love themselves. Loving themselves meant accepting that their wounds were real, that their feelings were valid, that they deserved peace. Slowly, the walls they had built began to crack, not because they were destroyed, but because they were no longer needed. They no longer had to be strong all the time. They were allowed to be tired, allowed to cry, allowed to ask for help. And the world did not collapse. One day, years later, they met their parents again. Time had changed many things. Their parents' hair had begun to gray. Their faces had aged. They looked at them no longer with burning anger, but with a calm distance. They were not seeking validation. they were not demanding apologies. They simply showed up as their new self, someone who had made peace with their past, even if not everything was resolved. They realized something important. Forgiveness does not always mean returning to how things were. Sometimes forgiveness means letting go of the hope that they will ever become different people. They chose healthy boundaries. They spoke when necessary, kept enough distance, no longer allowed words to tear down their self-worth. And for the first time, they felt strong, not because they were immune, but because they were aware. Aware that they were no longer the little child dependent on their parents' validation. They had grown. Believe this: someone who grows up in neglect can become one of two things: broken or aware. They almost broke, but they chose awareness. They realized that wounds do not have to be inherited, that they could become a gentler version for the next generation, that they could create the home they never had. A home is not merely a place, it is a sense of safety, of being heard, of being accepted. And now they are building that home within themselves. They may not have had an ideal childhood, but they deserve a healthy future. They may not be able to change their past, but they can choose how that past shapes them. And in the end, that is what matters most. Because the child who was once neglected now stands as someone who knows their worth, who knows their limits, who knows that loving oneself is not an act of selfishness, but an act of courage. They no longer walk with anger. They walk with awareness. And that is the quietest, yet most meaningful form of victory.